everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second evening of Vermont Law Review's annual symposium. Tonight, we will hear from the Separation of Powers panel before hearing from our keynote speaker, Senator John Tester from Montana, who can offer an on-the-ground perspective of the last 4 years. Once again, each of these will be followed by a question and answer session. So if at any point you have a question, feel free to drop it into the chat box and it will be relayed to the moderator. The separation of powers panel is a bit unconventional as it invokes both the doctrine itself and the plain meaning of the words. Under President Trump's administration untraditional separation of powers model, this panel evaluates the effects on some of the separating powers in our country. The panel looks at the polarization in America and how that has fed into the politicizing of the courts, the separation of power between the federal government and our sovereign nations, and how President Trump worked in Indian country. Lastly, the panel discusses the attempted checks on the balance of power between our three branches and the continuing life of our democracy moving forward. Thank you all again for attending, and it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our two symposium editors, Kelsey Schweitzer and Caitlyn Fury. I have deeply enjoyed working with both Kelsey and Caitlyn this past year on putting together this symposium, and am eternally grateful for them for their diligence in planning this event and all the amazing work they've done. So please join me in welcoming Kelsey and Caitlyn.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second night of Vermont Law Review's first ever virtual symposium, Volume 45, discussing the 45th administration of the United States. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Kelsey Schweitzer, and I'm one of the two symposium editors that helped organize this event. In many ways, this event has felt like an appropriate JD thesis for Caitlyn and I. Like many of our friends and classmates at Vermont Law School, it was the campaign, election, and immediate actions of Donald Trump that drove us to law school. Like many of us, I never thought of law as an option. My brain is very math and science oriented, and my primary drivers are outside. I grew up on a farm in Montana, and while I was lucky to have conservation-minded and politically active parents opening my eyes, what my eyes saw was a world that needed protecting, and my tool was always going to be science. Because humans will only conserve what they love and only love what they understand, I made it my job to understand as much as I could about the natural world and to share it with others. I majored in biology and learned about the important ecological victories, like gray wolves saving the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. After college, I moved to the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem to continue to learn and share as much as I could, working for the National Park Service and leading wildlife tours in the parks. However, in 2016, my feelings began to change as I watched the former President Trump become the Republican nominee and then president-elect. Our changing political and environmental climates meant I could not continue my carefree life in the Tetons. But my science background felt so useless in the era of alternative facts. I watched in horror as the new administration delisted species needing protections and reduced national monuments I had explored, opening them up to extensive mineral extraction. And there I saw law, where the rubber met the road, and I knew I needed to be a part of those battles. I dove in and never looked back. Vermont Law School has given me so many exciting and unique experiences to prepare me for a future fighting for the environment or helping to shape policy. I was able to choose from a wide array of environmental classes and clinics and score internships with leading public interest environmental groups. Thanks to my experiences here, I sleep better knowing I am taking steps towards making a difference. The Trump administration came in promising to be unconventional. For better or worse, it sought to disrupt, and arguably did disrupt, so many of the so-called norms of politics and American government. Although there was constant media coverage, much of it failed to grapple with the ways the Trump administration challenged many of our assumptions about American government and the long-term implications it posed. Having moved on to a new administration, this symposium, the 45th on the 45th, provides an opportunity to step back from the fast-paced media coverage of the last 4 years and reflect and think about the long-term implications of the Trump administration. Last night, we engaged in a lively discussion of Trump's use of the executive powers. We had scholars in support of a stronger unitary executive and scholars in support of greater agency independence discuss the pros and cons, strengths and risks of these theories. I loved listening to this panel because it felt so different from the conversations we'd had over the last 4 years. It was not charged or aggressive, but a flow of ideas and deep conversation looking into the Trump administration's how the Trump administration pushed and challenged the limits of the Constitution to exact his agenda, and how we might check this authority going forward. Salman Rushdie said that academic institutions should not be safe space from thought, but rather a safe space for thought. And last night we watched a civil conversation explore the marketplace of ideas. Our environmental legacy panel then focused that conversation to the use of the executive fiat to enact a devastating environmental agenda, the agenda that drove me to law school. We heard about the agency's statutory interpretation of public leasing laws and how it enabled mineral extraction that will persist and burn for decades. We discussed how the executive can roll back protections and regulations and fail to enforce environmental violations, which perpetuates those problems. And we learned how this executive fiat can vary by comparing presidents' use of the power to create, which shapes the implied power to destroy. The panel discussed whether it was good or dangerous to give so much legal interpretation power to the executive, and how we can move forward to exact a more environmentally stable policy for the US. Tonight, we'll be zooming the lens out. Our separation of powers panel speaks more to the plain meaning than the doctrine, to discuss how all powers are separating or converging as exemplified by the 45th administration. We will hear about a wide array of topics, including Trump's influence in Indian country, how his controversial nature widened political and ideological gaps that contributed to gridlock in the legislature and politicized courts, and how these political divides have challenged some important checks on the executive like never before. It is these ideological and political divides I find most terrifying. Watching ideas and opinions grow more extreme and the idea of compromise become increasingly unpalatable makes me worry about progress. Perfection should not stand in the way of progress, and learning how to work with people different from us rather than against them will help us going forward. That's one of the many reasons I'm so excited about our keynote address from my home state senator, Jon Tester. Senator Tester is currently the only Democratic member of the Montana congressional delegation. His moderate record has earned him appeal broad enough to send him to the Senate 3 times, including most recently in 2018, just 2 years after former President Trump won Montana by some 20 percentage points and visited Montana 5 times to campaign against him. Senator Tester frequently crosses the aisle to effectuate progressive policies with Republicans while maintaining a firm stand to fight for what is right. Last year, he was instrumental in passing the Great American Outdoors Act with bipartisan support, a monumental bill which will ensure funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I am really excited about this opportunity to hear from a Montana Democrat who has created his own political brand that works to actually create meaningful policy without abandoning his progressive values. While the last 4 years has done so much to divide us, it has also done so much to bring us together. We watched record numbers of men and women turn out in a pandemic to vote or band together to march for Black lives. Women began speaking up for each other through Me Too, and my classmates and I started down a path towards advocacy. As future and present advocates, I hope this symposium helps further your careers. I hope you all enjoyed last night as much as I did, and then you're ready to continue that discussion tonight and going forward. And now, I would like to turn it over to my co-symposium editor, friend, and future advocate, Caitlyn Fury.
Thank you, Kelsey, and also Sarah, for those fantastic remarks. I'm afraid that in many respects, they've already said everything that I feel about our symposium today. So excuse me if anything in my remarks feels a bit redundant. Indeed, Kelsey and I coincidentally took almost identical paths to law school, winding our way through science, nature, and conservation work before being pulled into the arena of law due to the Trump administration's deregulatory agenda and what we both saw as affronts to the people and places we most care about. As a former graduate student in science, I have been lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you view it, to have a deep understanding about the climate disaster unfolding before our very eyes. Just this week, America experienced yet another once-in-a-generation storm, with Texas, Oklahoma, and other southern states weathering a truly awful winter storm event, with resulting power and water crises in the great state of Texas. I myself have family in Houston who luckily just got power back yesterday, but there's still so many people in the midst of a slowly unfolding disaster. My heart goes out to the people of Texas, and if you have the capacity to do so, I would recommend finding an organization to give a donation to, such as Austin Mutual Aid, the Houston Food Bank, or Feeding Texas. And while I personally see it as a futile exercise to finger point and lay the blame after each of these innumerable crises, there is no doubt that we have lost precious time over the past 4 years to deal with climate change. We can now clearly see that the view that economic growth can only come at the expense of the effort to combat global warming is a dangerous fallacy. And as the saying goes, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That is why I think it is an essential exercise to have this symposium, not only as a retrospective on the unique and unprecedented way the 45th administration approached governance, but to better understand and inform how we should move forward. There's been a lot of talk about undoing the Trump legacy, but where does that leave us? Does it truly leave us in a better position than we are in? I feel that there are more fundamental issues at play, one that require legal scholars, such as the ones we've assembled for the symposium, to delve into. That is why I'm so proud of this symposium. It represents a wide variety of scholarship from academics and practicing lawyers from across the country who have provided us and will provide later tonight with their insights into the legitimacy, legality, and legacy of the Trump administration. And that legacy is not wholly in the past. The specter of Trump still looms large within the Republican Party, and no matter your political affiliation, that is something that we all have to contend with in the months and years to come. This is a pivotal moment in the great American story, and it is up to all of you tonight to help steer us towards a brighter future. This, as mentioned before, this symposium is also unique to our journal, as it is our first ever all virtual symposium, although not by choice. I can't tell you how much I miss being at Vermont Law, taking classes at Oaks, passing my fellow students and friends in the Chase Breezeway, catching up with them, and chatting with Donna in the cafe. So much of this past year has been dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and some days it feels like we will be stuck in this forever. But with the vaccines, I know that brighter days are ahead, hopefully ones where we're not so tied to Zoom and Teams. But until that day comes, here I am, sitting in my house, speaking to an audience I cannot see. As you watch the rest of this symposium in your own homes, I hope you can take something useful away from it. So please ask questions of our panelists this evening through the chat function on Vimeo if you're watching through the Vermont Law website, or on Facebook if you're watching there, so you can be part of the conversation, and especially ask questions of our esteemed keynote speaker, the senior senator from Montana, Jon Tester. Kelsey and I are so honored to have him speak later tonight, and in fact, we have Kelsey to thank for his attendance. Indeed, working with Kelsey on this symposium, while it certainly hasn't been easy at times, has been one of the highlights of my law school career. She has been a fantastic partner in all of this, and I just wanted to thank her one more time for making this experience the best it could be, no matter what obstacles we encountered along the way. I would also like to personally thank everyone else who made this symposium happen, from the behind-the-scenes work with VLS staff like Emily Potts and Karen Henderson, to the support of our editor-in-chief, Sarah, and academic supervisor, Professor Fergosi, and especially our moderators, Pat Parento and Hillary Hoffman, who really stepped up for us, and of course, all of our wonderful panelists. It's so wonderful to see all the fruits of our labor yesterday during the first night, and I'm so excited for this evening. Thank you all for being here. Our first panel will begin shortly, so please stick around. We will get going at 4:30.